Welcome to Journaling with Nature, the podcast for those who want to turn curiosity into wonder, a pencil sketch into a rabbit hole of discovery, a moment of stillness into a life full of joy. I'm your host, Bethan Burton. Let's open the pages of our nature journals and explore this world together. Hello, this is episode 110. This is our first episode for the new year, and I want to say thank you to you for being here and for being patient with me, because this episode is a couple of weeks later than I had hoped, but we're on track now, and I'm looking forward to bringing you many new interviews this year with inspiring nature journalists. I'm so happy and excited to share this particular interview with you today. I'm speaking with fellow Queensland nature journaler and dear friend Dion. Dion is a deeply inspiring naturalist and teacher. She runs the Noosa and Sunshine Coast Nature Journal Club, gives workshops and classes throughout the year, and collaborates with community and citizen science groups to provide inspiration in both natural history and art that keeps people engaged and returning again and again to the practice of nature journaling. In our conversation, we speak about the naturalists and explorers who have influenced Dion's nature journaling style, collaboration and working with different community groups, and the importance of capturing personal stories for ourselves and for future generations. Let's listen. Dion, thank you so much for joining me for the first podcast for 2023. I'm so excited that my first guest is you.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me. It's been wonderful listening to the podcast, and it's great now to finally participate. So thanks for inviting me.
Yes. Oh, pleasure. So I don't know if you know this, but I always start by asking about nature experiences in childhood, and I was wondering if this love of nature and natural history has been with you from way back.
Look, yes, most definitely. I was a bit of a closet nature obsessive because I think in the family I grew up in, the girls really weren't encouraged to go and dig in the mud for bugs and climb trees and all of that kind of thing. But I did anyway, and I, kept it on the down low, I think, for the most part. But yeah, nature was a really big deal. I grew up in a town, Ballarat in Victoria, that when I was a young girl was still very rural / regional. And, when I go back there now and I look at some of the places where I sort of dug for mushrooms in the fields and climbed trees and so forth, they're all gone. They're all sadly suburbs now. So, I think definitely nature's always been a huge part of my life and a big part of my childhood, and I think it's really the only happy place that I knew sort of at that time. And, well, I mean, not the only happy place, but a really happy place for me. So, and it still is. Yeah.
And so I know you've also had a long career as an artist, and I'd love for you to talk a little about your development, your career, your passion for art, and then how you sort of came down and focused on nature as your artistic expression.
Yeah, it has been a long time, and I don't like to count the years because it just reminds me of how old I am. But yeah, look, I've always been drawn to art, and I remember as a really young girl, I had an obsession with carrying around a sketchbook, even as a toddler.
Wow.
So, I don't have a lot of memories of that, but my mother always told me that I always had a sketchbook in my hand. And, I didn't always scribble in it, but I always had it. I just loved a book. And so, the progression has just evolved from there. When I was probably in primary school, I think my parents recognised that I had a passion for sketching and drawing and art, not necessarily a talent. They're two very different things, but a passion. So they put me into private art lessons with a fabulous artist. I can't remember her name, Anne something, and she was magnificent. And she always did Australian bush scenes, like the eucalypts and, around Western Victoria where I grew up, places like the Grampians. She always did magnificent scenes and landscapes and so forth. And so I did lessons with her, and I don't think she was really perhaps a very good teacher because she was more interested in actually doing the art herself. And so I spent more hours watching her than I did actually learning. I think I was too young too. I think they put me in a bit young, but they were just trying to encourage something. So, I didn't keep going for very long. I think they noticed that it really wasn't doing much, but I watched and I observed very closely, and I've never forgotten it. I remember every brushstroke she ever made. And I remember, more importantly, the feeling that I would get looking at those pictures that she was doing. I was just amazed, and it was all nature. And so as the years went on, I've kept a journal, sketchbook, I think my whole life. They number in the hundreds now, and, wow. I think perhaps the first 95 need to be thrown in the bin. Not that I ever would, because they're a part of that journey, but
yes,
they're there. And so, I think I was a bit averse to formal structure. I didn't fit in with it very well, and I did art at school. And then when it came to choosing what to do as a tertiary option, I didn't choose art. I chose commerce. So, but it never left. I always kept it going. The problem was I never thought I was very good. But what I learned as the years went on is that whether or not you're good is not for you to say. It's for other people to say and for other people to determine. And, I think the hard part of the modern age is the constant comparison with everything that's going on online. And so you have to limit yourself a lot with that. And so it took a lot of years for me to develop my art in a way that was actually expressive. And even now, I often look at it and think it's not expressing everything that's going on inside me, what I'm trying to express. But I think through nature journaling, I'm learning that it's the expression, it's there, it's enough. And if I'm seeing the stories in my nature journal, it's for other people to decide whether they like it or not. It took me a long time to build the confidence to actually put my books and my pages online and share them.
Yes.
But, it struck me initially as being a vanity thing. I thought, I'm not that good. I don't want to share them. I've got no right to have my pages up there next to all these great people. But then I realised that's not what it's about. It's not about how good those pictures are. And so the art journey for me has been a lifelong one. And there are times now I've found my place, I think, in natural science.
Yes.
Illustration or natural science, nature journaling. And it's not about the result. It's the process by a long shot. And I think the confidence comes from learning that my process is unique to me, but there's a lot of similarities with what everyone else is going through. The difference is that, when my pages go up, you're looking at a lifetime of practice and practice and practice
yes.
and expression. And, like everything on the internet, it's all very curated. So there's a lot of pages that just are hideous that never see the light of day. The point is that you've got to find a way to follow your passion. And, nature journaling is the vehicle. The purpose and the fuel inside that vehicle is different for everybody, absolutely yes. everybody. And so, growing up in the country and being absolutely in love and knowing where I belong in terms of in nature was the epiphany, and nature journaling was the vehicle for that expression for me personally, and I've just stuck with it. I have not let it go, and it hasn't always been easy. In fact, a lot of the time it's not. You just got to be purposeful with having a crack at it. I'm probably gone way beyond the question.
No, that's beautiful. I love the way you express that it's your journey. It's everything that's important to you. It's the things that you want to focus on, and it's not the outcome. It's not making a picture to show necessarily. The showing is sharing a story. Like, look at this bug that I saw and it was doing this really weird thing, and isn't that exciting? And art is the vehicle for transferring that experience that you had in nature and sharing it with someone and sharing that idea. You have a very recognizable style. I find your style very reminiscent of like the old naturalists. Like it seems very I'm trying to find words to describe. It's very
old school.
It's not so much, it's just got this vibe about it that feels like you've picked up a book from the 1800s or something. It's beautiful. I love your style. And I'm wondering who have been your biggest influences in terms of developing your thoughts about field journaling and nature journaling and the things that you choose to put on your page and the style that you use. I wonder how you develop that and who have been your biggest influences.
Oh, that's a great question, because I think that's an important one. My influences have changed many times over the years because, the artistic journey is not, it's not a laid out sequential journey. It's very curly is the only way I can describe it. It's curly. So you kind of move forward and then you sweep back again and you move forward. And it's funny that you should say my style's distinctive. I think one of the biggest challenges for me over the last probably 15 years has been trying to land on a style that is, I think is me. And, we look at other people's work and we see things that we love and we think that's what I want to do. And I've heard people use the term nature journaling. What do they say? Nature journaling goals or ambitions. This is what I want my pages. This is how I want it to be. This is what I wanted to do. And, I've done that too. And so I've looked at other people's work and I've tried to, dissect how they've done it, or this is what I really love about it. And, whether you like it or not, and most of us don't, is that our own personal style will dominate. It'll emerge and dominate. And it doesn't matter how much I try and at times do things the way some other people do it. I can't anymore. I can't replicate what other people do. All I can do is do it the way I do it. And I think the biggest challenge with the journaling is been learning to accept my own style, learning to accept my own expression in comparison to other people. And, when you talk about, it seems rather reminiscent or vintage in the style, I think that was accidental, but not surprising, because I absolutely love the romance of the books of naturalists and explorers from a bygone era. I think cameras have been great for helping us with the process, but so much has been lost in the art of the sketchbook in this 21st century. And so to look back at not just the books of great explorers and naturalists who ran around the world on the tales of military conquests and missionary pursuits, but to dig into their journeys. And the thing I love about those books, and when I say that, Charles Darwin is my patron saint of nature journaling. Although he wasn't the artist, he was the observer. He was his curiosity was so profoundly untethered that he was able to see the world in a way that no one else could. Those who were tethered by religion or school of thought or cultural dominance and all of these other elements that shape the way they think. But for Charles Darwin, he was untethered. His original journey with the Beagle, the voyage of the Beagle, he was put on that boat with the instructions to get out into the world and prove the stories of the Bible. So he was looking for proof of the stories that existed in the Bible, when in actual fact, he went in the completely opposite direction. He never found proof of the Bible. All he found was proof that so many of the stories that the patriarchal religions were dictating at the time, as opposed to spirituality, in my book, completely different. I'm talking about the patriarchal structure of religion, which was forcing these great minds like Charles Darwin, these great explorers and these great adventurers to think in a certain way, and to have somebody like, with the depth of curiosity and courage that Charles Darwin had. And his books are amazing. They're brilliant reads. They're hard reads, very hard reads. They're all handwritten and, in a language and a style that's almost uninterpretable now. But I've read a lot of books written by other people about him. And, it's just amazing what he experienced and what he observed and how he was able then to develop his thinking based on direct observation. He had artists with him who were interpreting that. They had no cameras, of course, and so he had artists. And, looking at the books of seafarers, captains' journals, the captain's log on great voyages around the world, and the books of amateur and professional naturalists, and even more modern day things like Grinnell's projects and the methods that he developed. It just, I think that was my influence. And, most of their drawings, I think, were done with the intent of reproduction with, etchings and lithographs, and ours aren't. And so I struggled for a long time trying to replicate the way they were drawing things. So I didn't bother in the end because it just wasn't going to work. But the influences were there. And I loved not just the pictures that they drew in their journals. It was the stories they told of their experiences and their adventures. And I've said this many times, I say it in my classes. It's the greatest tragedy of the modern age is that there is so much still to discover. There's so much being discovered around the natural world. And with climate change and all of the challenges as we face as a global community, where all we're doing is taking hundreds of millions of photographs. There's no stories anymore of these amazing people who are out in nature exploring and trying to understand how these changes are impacting us and what they're doing. Their stories, their personal stories, their experiences of sitting in front of something, some plant, or, looking at a scene that's been decimated by floods or fires or what have you, they're gone. All we get is, it's a scientific rigor that has closed ranks around the natural world. And, we all just accept that it has to be proven, it has to be databased, and it has to be this and it has to be that, which I think it does. It's very important to have all of those things, but the people who are on the front lines are not telling their stories anymore. I can go to a museum and
That's so interesting about stories.
Yeah, go on.
No, I just wanted to say that idea that stories are lost when we lose this way of interpreting the world through ourselves. We can snap a photo and it's more distant, whereas if you interpret the world through your own experience and put that down on paper, that adds a story, like you say. I don't want to miss what you were going to say about museums.
Yeah, no, you're right. And, the very act of putting pen to paper uses a completely different part of the brain and a completely different process of thinking and memory and all of it. So it's really important. And, I think I started looking for opportunities to nature journal. And so I joined the field naturalists clubs and birding groups and things like this. And I would go out on field trips with them. And I knew nothing. I think I'd been journaling in nature for such a long time that I wanted to start to learn more about it. And so I turned to the experts and I started field tripping with them and asking questions and, trying to learn as much as I could. And to my absolute disappointment, nobody was interested in sharing. They didn't even want to teach me about how to bird watch. You know, they were too busy doing it themselves. And this is so much of a problem we have now. And as I was saying about the museums, I can go to these museums and these libraries, and if I'm lucky, I can see these books, the journals and the sketchbooks that these people kept, and I can read about their interpretations of the bird song they were listening to and the discomfort of ants biting their toes and rain pouring down on their heads and the oppressive heat of a rainforest. You know, I mean, it's all there. And so not only am I seeing what they were seeing through their sketches, but I found myself actually experiencing what they were experiencing. I was visualizing it, and it had a really profound impact. It took my breath away. And I wanted to know those stories of the modern age. I wanted to connect with naturalists and explorers and scientists who were out in the field, who were out in the world, and really try and understand what they were seeing, what their connections were, how they were feeling about what was going on. And there was nothing. No one's keeping them. No one's keeping these records. Their stories are lost. And the older they get, the quicker they forget them. And trying to get them to share them with you is a lot harder than you think. Of course, there's always those few who will sit down and share them with you, but they're not written down. And so I felt very sad about that because, you know, with the onset of the camera, we've lost the personal connection to nature. We've lost the ability to understand what people experience on a deeply personal level. And a sadder part of that is science has a tendency to discourage personal stories, in a very big way. And I know I was reading about, I'm not sure it was one of the Grinnell Project expeditions or something where all the scientists were, and they all still keep field journals. Every time I talk to a scientist, I'm like, do you still keep a field journal? Yes, we do. But there's always the but. We can't do this, we can't do that. It's all very quick, it's all very fast. We have to photograph and GPS it and da-da-da-da-da. All great stuff.
There's a method.
Right.
Yep.
And I understand that because they have to work so much faster than we ever had to before. But one of the expeditions put a communal journal out, and they were asking all of the scientists and research assistants at the end of the day to write in the journal things that they'd found, and experienced and so forth. And then one senior scientist came along and said, there's too much personal information in here in terms of how people feel. We don't care. And so they destroyed the journal.
Oh, dear.
I know.
That's a shame.
It is. It's heartbreaking because everything we know today about the natural world comes from the journals of those men and women who had the courage to go out and explore new things and new places. And we don't do that anymore. I would give my eye teeth to go on some field expeditions and some real exploring adventures with great people, and I would document the whole thing. I'd give my eye teeth for it. But no one would take me. Nobody's interested in an interpretation of that from a human perspective. But the entire world wants to know and should know what it's like to do that. And we can't all do it, but we can all pick up and read the books of those who do. And unfortunately, the greater the problems and the more rigorous the scientific process is. So I think all of these things have influenced me to develop a nature journaling process and to try and share and encourage as many people as I possibly can to the practice, so that there is a record, no matter how bad people think that their pictures are or writings are. And trust me, if people go and have a look at some of these old journals, they'll be like, oh my God, they're terrible. They are. They're shocking. They have no idea. But they didn't have the luxury of photos. They couldn't draw birds from photos. They had to do them dead. But if we, if we had access to all these great field scientists who've spent decades in the field doing all sorts of field research or expeditions or explorations, could you imagine how enriched all of our lives and understanding would be? And so,
yes,
I think that it's almost a responsibility for people to keep a journal.
Yeah, I really like that. And I'd love to talk more about the ways that you're getting this idea out. So you're a nature journal teacher. You've been developing your own workshops focusing on various areas, so art in science, field sketching and other things. I'd love for you to talk about your own workshops and the experience of passing on your passion to others and how that's been.
Yeah, well, I think the development of my workshops have come from, I think, my long experience of watching people struggle with the practice. And in my understanding, it's nature journaling, like so many things, is a spectrum. You have people who gravitate towards the artistic side. They're really interested in becoming better sketchbook artists. They want to be able to draw the things they're seeing, which is fabulous. And, we all oscillate right up and down the spectrum at all different times. And at the very other end of the spectrum, you have, the science community, people who are genuinely only interested in understanding, the nuances and the science of what they're seeing and writing that down. And then the rest of us sit somewhere in between. And, nature journaling as a practice is evolving. It's evolving so quickly.
That's true.
And, the science community are still sort of rejecting it a little bit, but then you get some of them who are beginning to see the benefits of it the more you persevere as a teacher. And, my workshops came from watching people struggle along that spectrum. And so I developed a program called, my first level 1 program is called The Art of Keeping a Nature Journal, where I spend, the whole program is dedicated to teaching people how to draw. And not just how to draw, but how to draw in the field, how to draw quickly, how to draw effectively, how to put pen to paper and draw something that is a recognisable interpretation of what they're looking at. And once people have that basic skill, and it doesn't matter how, I'm not talking about, shading and colour mixing and, dimension and proportion and all of these kinds of things and perspective, perfect perspective. I teach them how to construct a drawing so that they're able to really begin to understand that they can see what they're looking at. And it's hugely encouraging. People are going, and it's a lot easier than people think. It's not, I can teach somebody how to construct a basic drawing in 20 minutes. And, I've done it 100 million times. I'm not talking about a masterpiece. I'm talking about a basic drawing. And, I teach a lot in schools and I teach kids, we do a 1-hour session. Their time is short. So I teach them how to draw. We start with leaves and within 10 minutes, they're all going, oh my God, look what I've drawn. I can't believe I did this. This is amazing. And then they just apply those principles. And, so many of the artists I know now, the nature journalists, use exactly the same techniques. It's just demystifying it for people to understand that it's much more accessible than they think. And so I spend that first program on the art of it. And so they learn to draw and then they learn to use their tools effectively to develop their drawings. And so we start with graphite. So how do you use graphite? How do you use it in the field? How does it work? What are all the different weights? How is it relevant? Then we go to ink. And so we work on using inks, water-soluble inks or India inks, which are, water resistant and so on and so forth. And then we move to things like coloured pencils and watercolour pencils and watercolours and the basic gamut of tools that we as nature journalists would keep in our toolkit, whether it be some of them. And I provide most of the materials for people to use because not everybody gravitates towards coloured pencil
Yes.
or graphite or ink or so on and so forth. And then by the end of the class, people have begun to understand what works for them. But the very first thing they need to do is know how to draw. So I teach them to draw, and then I teach them how to use their tools. So that's my level 1. And then my level 2 class, which is called the practice of nature journaling. And this has come because once a person new to nature journaling knows how to use their tools, the books, the papers, the pens, the paints, whatever, if they know the fundamentals of using those tools, then what they need are opportunities to use them. The next challenge for them becomes, well, how do I build some kind of framework structure into my nature journaling? And so I developed the practice of nature journaling, which, you know, the support mechanism for that is habitats. We start with ocean, you know, we start right on the rocky shores of the open ocean. And, you know, we go to a different habitat, 8 habitats over 8 weeks. So we start in rocky shores and teach them about the habitat. I teach them about the creatures that exist within the habitat, and you teach them about how the habitats work and its patterns and cycles and all this sort of stuff. And then so we do a habitat and they get a project. So I give them a project, and it might be a biodiversity study. So I teach them what a biodiversity study is, and I teach them how to look for stuff and how to bring it all in as a collection. And in another project might be signs of life. That's one we do as we move inland, you know, signs of life. So I teach them how to look within their habitat for signs of life, tracks and leaf damage and scat and burrows and hides and all of these kinds of things that are right in front of our eyes but we don't really look at.
Yes.
And so each week they get a different habitat. We start at the rocky shores and we finish in the mountains, and we cover a habitat from rocky shores in the open ocean up to the mountain regions. And there's rainforest and there's open eucalypt forests if you're in Australia, or, you know, they'd be conifer forests if you're somewhere in North America. And we look at wallum and heath or prairies if you're in North America. We look at mangroves, which are all over the world. We look at freshwater wetlands. So different habitats gives us different subjects, different symbiosis, different connections, different creatures. And then each week they get a different project. I teach them, and that's a project based on observation. It gives them a framework for their journaling. And then they get 2 journaling strategies that they have to apply. So, you know, that can be things like zoom in, zoom out. A lot of the Jack Law's books that he's produced are brilliant for this. So as much as possible, I try and use, you know, Jack's ideas along with, you know, Claire Walker-Leslie or lots and lots of other people who have produced these great resources. Plus I use the endless amounts of books I have, the historical books of what explorers did when they were on expeditions and how they narrowed their focus. And then the third one, which I find really important because people get overwhelmed. Where do I start? There's so much going on. How do I know what to focus on? And so getting people to focus in on something. And so the third one comes from a lot of people who want to know more about the areas of natural science. You know, they might find after practicing this for a little while that they're particularly interested in insects or particularly interested in flowers or birds or any number of things. So my third class is the ologies of nature journaling, or the science of nature journaling. Yeah. And so each week's a different ology or a different science. And so we look at things like ornithology in a very rudimentary, very lay person's perspective. So birds, how do you understand birds, you know, and when you're observing and drawing birds, you know, how does it work? Because this was a question I had. What am I looking at? Yeah. What am I listening for? How can I know what to look for when I'm looking at something and capture it in my journal so that I can go away at a later stage and find out what it is. And it was the same thing with insects and invertebrates. And I do arachnology, which is spiders. I love spiders. Geology. We do a bit of archaeology, you know, and so I introduce people over an 8-week period to a different ology. And we touch on it, and I teach them, you know, how do we interpret it in our journals? What are the basic rock formations, you know, and things like rocks. Weather, meteorology is another one. How do you journal weather? How do you look at weather? How do you understand weather? And, you know, people just lap it up because all of a sudden they're having greater success with what's going on in their journal. They learn how to identify cloud cover. And, you know, and there's a lot of people doing this already, like Roseanne Hansen is a great example. She spends a lot of time with her sky scopedos, which you're involved with too. You know, brilliant, because, you know, by doing it and giving people some structure around their journaling focus keeps them at it longer. You know, because I found that by just saying, hey, let's get together and sit down on a mat and journal what we see in nature, it just wasn't keeping people there. It wasn't keeping them in the practice. People were hungry for more knowledge about what they were looking at and how does it work and how can they break it down. So, and once again in the ologies, you know, they get projects and they get journaling strategies. You know, rocks is a great one. You know, people love rocks because, you know, you learn how to draw something as simple and as a rock and, you know, it's brilliant, especially when you start to look at structures.
It's reminiscent of like being outdoors as a kid and rumbling around in the creek bed or whatever it was. It sort of brings back that feeling of play, I think.
Oh, absolutely, you know, and it gives people purpose. You know, it really gives people purpose for their journaling, and you know, it's what keeps them at it. And quicker than people realise, all of a sudden they've got these magnificent records of all of their learning journey and their nature journey. You know, and they can look back on it.
I love the way you're building, like giving someone the skills and the tools to say, okay, these are some actual materials that I can take with me into the field. And like you say, demystifying, what do I do with these things that I'm holding in my hand? And then also like practicing some techniques so that you can pull out those tools and you can pull out the strategies when you're out there, because sometimes you get the feeling like people are just standing out with their books and wondering like what next, and so you give them all these building blocks for knowing what to look at, what to focus on, and what techniques to use in the journal when they're standing out there with a blank page. Exactly,
you know, and I find, you know, great example. We were out doing the ornithology, the birds class, and one of the participants came up and she's like, I don't think I'm into birds. I don't think birding's for me.
Yeah.
And I'm like, great.
Well, that's good knowledge. Yeah.
That's, you know, that gives her something, you know, because we don't always know what we're not interested in. And then, you know, I find people come with so many phobias and prejudices to the arachnology and the entomologies, the insects, and teaching people, you know, how to catch bugs safely and harmlessly, you know, how then to observe and examine and study those creatures, and then how to safely, well, how to draw them, what to look for, you know, because we don't know what they are. I don't know what they are. I'm not a scientist. So I catch spiders or beetles and I've got no clue what they are. But what I do know is how to record that, what's important, which is quite different for a lot of things. And, you know, and this happened to me, you know, we were sitting under a pandanus tree, unique to the coastal regions in Australia, and this fabulously huge bug fell out of the pandanus tree onto one of the students' books, and she's like, oh, look what just landed on my book. So, you know, I had a collection jar, put it in the jar. We studied it. We drew it. We did colour studies of it. We measured it. Did all this stuff that I teach people how to do.
Yeah.
We wrote a story about how it fell out of the tree and landed on, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and the whole shebang. And then I showed the page to an entomologist, a scientist who specialises in the pandanus-tree, and they just jumped over the moon. It was a beetle that is undescribed, but in the process of being researched and studied. Yeah, and that they've had a really hard time finding enough of them for a proper description.
That's
and
amazing.
The fact that we found one gave them a pinpoint and to
it
go
literally
and look for more
fell
of
on
them.
the book.
So
That's amazing.
it fell on the book. And the thing was that because the drawings aren't always great in the field. In fact, field drawings are generally pretty bad. But the information was there. The information about eye arrangement and leg arrangement and colour and, colour matching, and the information about how it behaved and how it, it was all there in 10 journals, because there were all these different people there, that they were able to get all that information, and the scientists were then able to, off they went, prolifically grateful to the nature journalists for giving them some insights. And so, that stuff like that doesn't always happen, but it's pretty exciting when it does.
Yeah, and that highlights something that I wanted to talk to you about, which is collaboration. You work with different groups. Recently worked with Mooloola River Landcare, and you've worked with lots of other groups, bringing together citizen science and nature journaling, and this idea of collaboration and how learning and participation and sharing information can be just so beneficial for everybody involved. I'd love for you to talk about that.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of collaboration. I think that, the collective mind is far more powerful and far more creative than the individual. And everybody brings something to the table. And I've been really fortunate with some of the organisations who have gone, what is this nature journaling thing? Do you want to come along and teach us a little bit about it? And they realise very quickly the benefits of it. We've still got a lot of work to do, the nature journal community, in opening the eyes again of the science community. They've shut down a bit in recent decades, and to them it's like, it's just a pastime, but it's not. It's powerful and it's important to those of us who like to sort of gravitate towards that end of the spectrum. But the Mooloola River Landcare is a great example, and the landcare organisations all over Australia are so important. It's like Australian Conservation Organisation and, all of these amazing organisations who are struggling to keep people involved. And citizen science is a perfect example, because they've realised the power of the citizen, the general person, just somebody interested enough in nature, looking for a little more of a purpose with it. They do great work, and so they set up citizen science projects that are accessible and available to all of us. And they're built with scientific rigour. There are scientists involved in designing studies and methodologies and so forth. And the Great Aussie Bird Count is one good example. And they provide tools.
Yes.
And for those of your listeners who are aware of iNaturalist, a really important one, it's a database of photographs of the natural world that is just being built upon. The problem citizen science were facing a couple of years ago was that they couldn't keep citizens engaged. People would come along and do a project here and a project there and hand all this data to the database through iNaturalist, and, then they fell flat. They didn't get much out of it except for that quick fix of experience. And so I went to the ASCA, the Australian Citizen Science Association, and said, you need to introduce nature journaling because people need a purpose. They need a reason. And as the science community is notorious, it's take. This is what we want. Give it to me. Find the information, discover nature, send me photos, my database, my research. It's all about me. And they're not giving much back except the joy of people knowing they're contributing to science, which is important. People need more than that if they're going to stick at something long term. And so I spoke to the Australian Citizen Science Association and said, you need to introduce the concept of nature journaling. Teach people how to keep a nature journal, why it's important, and why it's important both to them and to citizen science, to the scientists, and why the scientists should recognise this. And so I was very fortunate to be asked to run a nature journaling program for the Cooloola BioBlitz, which is a citizen science project, an intensive field trip, all field-based. They bring in scientists from all over the country, and anyone can sign up for it. And the scientists lead field trips in their specialist areas. So they'd have ornithologists and botanists and geologists and mycologists and arachnologists and entomologists and mammal specialists and herpetologists, snakes and everything that you could possibly hope for. And you sign up and you go along and you can get to choose whichever of these field trips you're interested in going on. And so the scientist takes you out and, they collect, they search for all of these things and they collect and they document. And it's a way to try and determine the biodiversity of a particular region. Brilliant. But what was happening was that people were just following a scientist around and asking questions and looking and taking photographs and uploading their photographs. They weren't participating, they were observing. And that bothered me. And the scientists weren't sharing enough. They weren't sharing enough. They were sharing. It was great, but they weren't sharing enough. So they invited me to come along and set up a nature journal program. And so we did. We added a nature journaling stream. And so I ran, I started with, this is how you do field sketching. This is what I'd like to be in the field. This is what a field study is, blah, blah, blah. So I ran workshops in that area. And then when the field trips went out, a scientist would join the nature journal team. So we had 15 nature journalers, and so day one we had a botanist who we'd go into different habitats, and that botanist would do the botany stuff, but he'd have to teach us. He'd have to talk to us about it and how to identify and what to look at. And then we were all journaling, and then as he was collecting, I was giving instruction about how to journal this, how to record what he's doing, how to capture the data, and then it was this wonderful back and forth. And this botanist was sharing so much and people were asking questions and they were enriched. And at the end of the day, they had the whole experience recorded in their journals, pictures and data and stories. And then each day we had someone different. We had an arachnologist, we'd go spider hunting, and we'd have we had the pandanus specialist, so we had a day under the pandanus trees, which was wonderful. Absolutely, I got some stories for that, but we'll save that for another time. And so, and citizen science is a global organisation. They're all over the world, and they have tons and tons of projects. Like so many, it's overwhelming to look at them. Birds and bird counts or biodiversity studies or water bug monitoring and Mooloola River Land Care received some citizen science grants to do community connection projects. So, they did Mooloola River Land Care monitoring, and they did water bug monitoring, and then they did invertebrate studies, and they do plant studies, plant habitats, and all sorts of things. And so a couple of those people were at one of the BioBlitz events, and so they were just thrilled. They did the nature journaling, couldn't believe it. They'd never had any idea what it was or how it worked, and they couldn't believe the benefit that they were seeing it was giving to anything that's trying to engage the community or general population. And so they invited me first to run a workshop in their facility to teach people about what nature journaling was, and then from there They get quite a lot of citizen science grants, and so I've done tons of workshops with them now on invertebrate studies, field studies, habitat studies, butterflies, all of it. And so, you know, their scientists are there sharing and teaching the science, and I'm there sharing and teaching, you know, nature journaling and collection and communication and study and observation and all the stuff that the science doesn't happen without all this stuff. And it's bringing people in. And the thing is that people are staying. They're sticking at it.
Yes, and this is the thing. When you want to engage someone, when you want them to really cement an experience or knowledge, or, you know, if you want to them to internalize something, you have to move them. You have to engage them in a sensory way. You have to give them experiences that are surprising and delightful and bring up emotion and engage all the senses. And that's exactly what you're doing. You're turning the science. You're helping the scientists give this experience to people that's really visceral, that's really joyful and surprising, and they're making their own discoveries, and they're putting that in a journal that they can then take away with them. And that's much more moving than just using, you know, one track, which is like listening to a scientist. That can be great and that can be surprising in itself, but to make it more three-dimensional, to make it more personal, to make it something that they can internalize and take away with them and want to do again and again and again, that's what your job is in this collaboration.
Right. And, you know, it's working beautifully because it's people get hungrier and hungrier. They get hungrier for the knowledge. They want to know more. And, you know, I think what they begin to do is they start creating a pool of experienes.
Yes.
That they can actually remember because they have these books and, you know, their legacies. I mean, the number of people that have come into my classes with a landscape, watercolour picture that their great aunt had done, and it had been handed down from the family. And they're so proud of it. And look what my aunt, you know, and it came to me and it's so precious, you know, and it might not be very good technically, but who cares? It's become profoundly valuable to them and their legacy of family, their experiences. Yes. And so over time now, because we're seeing this movement has gained a little bit of longevity. Nature journaling has now been around for quite a few years, thanks to Jack and all of the people that have embraced it for what it is. Mm-mm. And the people have got books. They've got 3 or 4 books on their bookshelves, and now they're able to pick up those books. Yeah. And their whole lives are there. All those beautiful experiences are there. And, you know, the number of people that said, oh, I opened a book from 2 years ago and, oh, my gosh, I was right back there. And do you remember this and that? And, I mean, I just go, mic drop, my job's done. You're here for good. And you know, this is here. Yeah. And I say your children and your grandchildren are going to treasure these books because the world they live in is going to be so different to the world we're living in now. And they need to see these books. They need to see these experiences happen. They need to hear these stories. And, you know, when you've got, I don't know about you, Bethan, but I just did a photo dump off my phone, 10,000 photos.
Yes,
because we all go around clicking with our phones. And I swear I've taken all those photos and I've never looked at them again, and I put them all onto a hard drive, and I know I will never look for them again. And when I want to find something, I can never find it. There's too many photos there. So, you know, the number of people that have that same experience, it's great to have our cameras there, especially if we want to snap a bird and then refine our sketches of it at a later stage. Yeah. But phones are so unreliable. They distort perspective. They dilute or distort colours. They distract you as well. You don't have the experience of the actual thing. I remember going whale watching, and we saw this humpback whale like breaching, and it was amazing. We saw this baby whale with its mother, and it was so good. And I was trying to take photos, and then after a while I realized I'm missing it.
and I put the camera down and I just soaked it in. And I think that the camera can get between us and the experience sometimes.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a brilliant way of putting it, because that's exactly what happens. The camera gets in the way. And the problem too is that we think as participants that we have to capture every single moment, that we have to look at everything. You know, we've got to see this, and we've got to look at that, and we've got to see this and see the bird and see the this and see the that. And we're so fast and so trying to take in everything that we miss everything. And nothing sticks to our experience. Nothing sticks in our memory. And, you know, I find even this with my classes, you know, once we get into the habitats, the people are like, oh, I don't know what to do. There's so much. I can't choose.
Yes.
I give them a list. I give them 8 things. Each week they get a list of things with their projects, you know, to focus their project on. And they all say, oh, I want to do them all. And I say, well, you can't. You can't do them all effectively. You need to make a choice and choose one thing to focus your attention, to focus your awareness. And then you can come back tomorrow or in 3 weeks' time and choose another thing. But you know, teaching people to slow down in order to allow their observations and the experience of nature to truly penetrate their psyche, that's what doesn't happen. It's like oil and water. We go into nature with our cameras and our limited amounts of time and our thousands of dollars of great hiking shoes and backpacks and equipment, and we go traipsing through nature thinking we're having the experiences, but nature's just washing off our backs. We're not really absorbing it because we're going too fast, and we think taking photographs is going to solve that problem, but it doesn't. I found personally there's only 2 ways to do it. One is to sit and listen and look and don't do anything. Clear your head and just let nature be, and you be in nature. And the other one is to do it with a sketchbook in your hand and try and record or write what it is you're focusing on, and to force yourself to focus in. It's the power of focus. We've lost it as a species, and I think it's beautiful to try and find ways to get it back. For me, anyway.
Yeah, I agree. And I love this idea that what we are creating day by day is going to be valuable in the future to those people who loved us, you know, and who want to know our experience of nature, but also seeing things that have been lost. But it was reminding me of a painting that I received when my paternal grandmother died, many years later after she died, but she was an artist and loved nature. And I received this original painting of hers, and it's a jar of tadpoles. And the story behind it is that my dad and his sister collected these tadpoles and brought them home in a jar, and my grandmother was inspired by that and sat down and painted this jar of tadpoles. And the story behind that, like, that's a little snapshot of my dad, my family, my dad's childhood, my grandmother, and the things she was inspired by. And it's so valuable to me, I can't even describe it. And it captures that in a really beautiful, important way that's hard to describe, but that I treasure. And I like to think about nature journals being that for someone in the future.
Oh, I agree. What they do is they turn the mundane into the magnificent, in the moment and in the future.
Yes, I love that.
I do too, because that's what it does for me, you know, because sometimes, you know, we're so encased in expectation, you know, expectation that our drawings have to be immaculate, expectations that our handwriting, our penmanship has got to be spectacular, expectations that every single page of this new sketchbook we've just purchased has to be perfect. And it's never going to be that way. It's never going to be that way. And, you know, we go into nature with the expectation that everything has to be unique or extraordinary or a first, you know. Go into nature and look at the everyday, the mundane, and it transforms. Once you start observing and capturing it in your book, it transforms and it becomes magnificent.
That's beautifully, beautifully said. I wonder about the future of nature journaling and the future of your practice and your teaching. And I wonder if you have any ideas about what you hope to grow in the future and what the direction you hope to see nature journaling traveling in the future.
Good question. Complex question. Quite a good one. I think it's twofold for me because of the journey that I've taken. And I think first and foremost, it's people's ability to engage in the practice. And, you know, it helps them let go of unrealistic expectations. It helps them embrace themselves in a much more authentic way. Because most of us, 99% of us, are not great artists. We're not. Otherwise, we'd have our art hanging in the walls of great museums, you know. But I don't know about you, but, you know, I wanted to be a botanical artist and, you know, a hardcore scientific illustrator and all that kind of stuff. And, you know, I knew I could get good at it if I studied and practiced and studied and practiced and studied and practiced. But it didn't hold the depth for me. It didn't, you know, even now I get asked to do commissions or what have you, and I turn most of them down. I've accepted one, which I kind of regret accepting now because I've got too much on my plate. Yes. So, you know, I mean, I think it's different for everyone, but, you know, I think nature journaling helps us all. It helps us connect to the natural world in an authentic way. And by doing that, it helps us connect to ourselves in an authentic way because, like it or not, we're a part of the natural world. We're organic. And, you know, we have to get back into that rhythm because I just think I'm a better human being. I accept myself so much more for all my flaws and foibles and faults. And, you know, I realize that I am enough and that my journals are enough. Yeah. And, you know, the pages that I produce in the moment are enough because when we make it about the perfect book, we lose sight of what it's really all about. And when we make it about the pure science, we lose sight of what it's really all about. And there's a middle ground that then encompasses our personal journey and our growth as individuals and our place in the world. And it takes away the unrealistic striving we all do towards perfection and excellence and helps us accept ourselves as enough. And if nothing else, and I see this with children because I spend a lot of time teaching children, they learn very quickly that it's not a static process. You don't come to the table with all the skills. And if you don't have the skills, I am crap and no good at it and this is not for me, and they abandon it really quickly. It's helping people realise that life in every single way is an evolutionary journey and that the skills we acquire in order to navigate life and not just, you know, the responsibilities and challenges, but to navigate the purposes and the joys and the connections and the beauties and to find ways to imprint them into our hearts comes by stepping on the road, by actually doing it. And I think children have taught me, okay, so I can't draw that butterfly perfectly right now, but I'm going to have another go tomorrow. And that butterfly may not be perfect, but it reflects exactly the experience I had, you know, and the moment I'm in. And kids accept that unquestioningly. And I would like more adults to go back to that. So, you know, that's all very philosophical and profound. But, you know, it is really it's that whole circle of artistic and scientific and spiritual and organic and natural and, you know, all of the important things that make us, I think, fundamentally human in a world that doesn't really fit most humans.
Yes, I 100% agree. And I love the way you bring it all together in your teaching and in this conversation. And I just want to say thank you so much for joining me. It's been so warming and wonderful to talk to you, and I really love and value your insights. Thank you.
And thank you, Beth. And I absolutely love journaling with nature, and I think the work that you do is so important to the global community, and I'm so grateful to be a part of it and to have people like you to inspire me along the way. So thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Dion. I adored listening to her thoughts on all these different topics, and especially on the importance of personal stories. How when she was reading old books, she was able to be transported by the accounts of naturalists from history into the forest with them, and how we can do the same in our own journals. I also enjoyed Dion's thoughts on finding a middle ground in our journals, letting scientific investigation and personal stories coexist to build a really rich narrative that will be important for those who come after us. As always, please take a look at the show notes for this episode, where you'll find links to Dion's social media, and you'll be able to look through the pages of her journals. Thank you so much for listening. See you next week.